So, to finish things off, we shall finish with the final part of the debate, and we shall see if Kahindi knocks him out the box.
Right? Don't you think that, 100 years of that would leave a legacy that was detrimental?
That question was so hard, he literally starts shaking.
In what way? Yes, look, the point was the pre-state societies were far more brutal. So yes, I'm not...
So he says the pre-state societies in Africa were way more brutal. I'm going to let go of that word pre-state society, even though a lot of the kingdoms in Africa were recognized by Europe as actual states. So whatever measure you consider a state as, they actually were states. They're not pre-state societies. But the word that he uses that pisses me off, he says they were far more brutal. Now, here's the funny part. If we look at pre-Europeans arriving in Africa, we can separate Africa into smaller pieces, and we can separate the brutal parts from the non-brutal parts. Like if you take South Africa, for example, where the Europeans first landed, when they got there were hunter-gatherers known as the Khoisan. The idea that these people were way more brutal than what the British were or the Dutch were or any of these Europeans were when they started selling slavery. The Khoisan didn't even have slavery. They lived a very, very, very peaceful life. They were in no position to have slaves. And they lived in wide areas with a very small population. So that's nonsense. In Namibia, it would have been the same with a mix of Bantu people. But these Bantu people, again, were very peaceful who lived in these areas. No signs of mass killings, no signs of any of that. Only when you get to Angola do you start to see real wars prior to the Europeans showing up. But even these wars were nothing compared to what would happen afterwards, where they started taking slaves from this area by the millions. And then you have the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is internal, slightly different than the proper Kingdom of Congo. And this area has no real signs of violence of the levels that would happen when Leopold came in. West Africa had a history of slavery, of course, and it had its fair share of wars with other North Africans. But again, that became nothing compared to what the Europeans did to them. So if we just separate that very small little bit, we take the Swahili coast and all these places, and we just keep comparing each country by each country, you will see that the concept that they were more violent before the Europeans came in is dumb.
Saying that these were wonderful places necessary to live, but racism was abhorrent at that time. Look.
Okay, so racism was horrible at the time. Who was doing the racism? It was horrible at the time. That's what you said. So who was doing the racism?
Britain is now the world's third least racist country. But back in the 19th...
Third least racist country according to who? Who is this person measuring? Because by my estimation, still, I would say top 5 racist countries. If I had to put top 5 in my list, it would be the Americas. I just put all of them in there. Some parts of Africa where there's still South Africans, Egyptians, that's another one. North Africa is a good one. Some parts of Africa would be in my top 5. Definitely Europe, especially the parts where there's a lot of people of different races. Western Europe, to be exact. Then parts of the Middle East like Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Syria, those type of places. So this idea that they're like, oh, the third least racist country, that is not a fact at all. And you're proof of that, by the way.
Century, of course, everyone did believe in racial hierarchies. Britain was very racist in the start of the 20th century as well. No one is denying that. No one is denying the atrocities. My father was born in Kenya, along with all his family.
Yeah, he's rambling at this point. He's going to say a whole bunch of stuff that's happening everywhere. But what he said over there is very technical. He tried to say that the British were racist during the first half of the 20th century. They also were very racist during the last half of the 20th century. Then, of course, he says that his family was born in Kenya. So those of you that don't know, there used to be a lot of people in Kenya who are white. I mean, I think Richard Dawkins is also born in Kenya. So there used to be a lot of people from Britain who were born in Kenya, and a lot of them left a long time ago to go back to England. And then there's other people who are born in very similar areas, like Farouk Bulsara or Freddie Mercury, who was born in what is today Tanzania, but at the time it was called Zanzibar or Zanzibar, the land of the Zanj.
What happened to the Mau was terrible and everything else, and the Kikuyu and so forth. But the point.
So for any of you who are curious what they actually did in Kenya, the British, I'm not going to explain it here, but I will link this video. If I don't link it, remind me to link it in the description in the comments, because this is a very important video that will summarize for you exactly the role of the British in, at least in East Africa and Kenya. By the way, for anyone who does not like depressing news, do not watch this video.
Point was terrible compared to what? The conditions that were there before, when you had terrible violence, of course, between rival tribes, you had warfare, you had malnutrition, you had poor water, you had disease, people's life expectancies were so short.
So everything is a nonsense that he said. So he said 3 things, but it sounded like he said 4. But he said they had warfare. I've just debunked that. They didn't have warfare everywhere. And most of the time they had peace. 2, he said there was malnutrition, which every place in the world had malnutrition. But the level of malnutrition went up when the Africans lost control of their lands. I've read about almost all the kingdoms that existed in Africa, and not a one do they mention vast numbers of malnutrition until they were attacked by foreigners. And of course, most Africans actually had their diseases intact. I mean, compare the number of people in Europe who died from diseases versus the number of people in Africa who died of diseases. It's not even comparable. And then, of course, compare the diseases that Europeans brought to Africa. A lot of the diseases that killed off the Native Americans, they brought them to Africa as well. It's just we didn't die the same numbers. Now, I don't recommend ChatGPT as a fast way or a way to collect evidence, final evidence, but this is the fastest way that I can think of getting this type of information, which is well-known information. So we know that diseases from the 1300s to the 1700s in Europe were devastating. So you can see there, bubonic plague, 75 million to 200 million people, 50 to 60 million in Europe alone. So 50 million to 60 million people in Europe alone. That's a bubonic plague. Smallpox, 10% of total deaths in Europe. 1500s to 1700s, millions more, often during wars and sieges. Now let's compare that to the African population. You can see here, this is again based on a lot of collection, but ChatGPT is good for summaries. Africa's experience was very different, not because it was disease free, but because it had endemics, not epidemics, disease patterns. Tropical disease like malaria, yellow fever, sleeping sickness were constant, not episodic. Africans developed partial immunity to many local diseases through long exposure. No Black Death or similar continental-wide epidemic struck Africa. Populations were less urbanized and more dispersed, slowing epidemic spread. Major cause of death in Africa pre-1700s, disease, mortality impact notes. Malaria epidemic, high child mortality, especially deadly for outsiders, Europeans. Smallpox, present but regional. Epidemics occurred but were not as devastating as in Europe. Trypanosomiasis, localized, sleeping sickness, localized, limited to the tsetse fly. Dysentery and fevers, common, high background mortality. Okay, so the conclusion, overall estimates by 1700, disease mortality in Africa was high in infants, but mass adult epidemics were less frequent than in Europe. Africa's population was growing modestly, unlike Europe's repeated collapses. So this idea that all Africa was just this piece of garbage place where diseases were just everywhere and blah blah blah. And of course they talk about the entire continent when they say less urbanized, which is absolutely 100% true. Not urbanized, less urbanized. And so there was a lot of places that diseases could not jump from one place to the other. They would just stay in that one region. And then, of course, there was immunity and even some deliberate immunity.
You compare that to what happened afterwards, clearly a huge improvement with the benefit of industrialization and development.
So let's take the information that we already know about Africa. In fact, I want to use ChatGPT a little bit as well to try and get this information because it'll be real funny. So he said when the Europeans came, all of a sudden diseases went down. They brought the diseases down. Really? You know, in Africa, we never had anything close to what the HIV crisis did in South Africa and in other parts of Africa. You know that before the Europeans came, we never had anything close to what fevers started doing and what some of these other diseases started doing. Again, if we use AI, use ChatGPT, we can see that after colonization, medicalization, urbanization, and epidemics in 1900s to 1960, colonization changed Africa's disease environment dramatically, both positively and negatively. New challenges factor urbanization and mining camps, outbreaks of tuberculosis, influenza, dysentery, war and forced labor, epidemics and of famine, disease, sleeping sickness spread, especially Congo, Uganda, Tanganyika. Now remember, sleeping sickness was limited in the previous one. Introduction of new pathogens like cholera, influenza, tuberculosis. Now that's the water one I wanted to answer, but let's go back. So he said the water was not good in Africa. No, the water was clean as hell. They had systems of getting rid of these toxic stuff of humans, but they didn't have some of the ones that came with the level of urbanization and then neglect and then pollution that the Europeans came with, which came with cholera, which you'll notice in the previous one, they didn't mention cholera at all. Disruptions of indigenous medicines, traditional healers, marginalized European medicine slow to reach rural areas. So doctors who of course had a limited amount of workingness, but they did work, their medicines were stopped. And so a lot of people didn't even practice that anymore. But then the Europeans didn't even go to the areas where some of these people got sick. And so some people just got sick and died. Now, here's the part that's actually funny because I didn't do anything. I just wrote the difference between prior and after in terms of disease. New controls, quinine, anti-malaria, saved many Europeans but limited native access early on. Vaccines, gradual decline in smallpox death. Public health campaigns improved sanitation, though unevenly distributed. Improved nutrition or transport reduced famine mortality in some colonies. Now, keep in mind, you see there that it's written 3 at the top. So I put there 3 things. 1 after colonization, 1 during colonization, and another one before colonization. Before colonization, one of the cleanest periods. During colonization, one of the worst periods. And then after colonization, they still had a fallout from what had happened prior when they were colonized. So as mentioned earlier, most of the diseases were endemic, but then they started bringing in measles, influenza, syphilis, and then it became more widespread and lethal. Spread of smallpox became more widespread and lethal and then malaria zones expanded, yellow fever expanded, the human and ecological disruption, slave trade, depopulated regions, destroyed food systems. This is not Afrocentric.com. This is ChatGPT. The history that this guy is peddling isn't even close to mainstream. So, in other words, the idea that Europeans helped us in the areas that they think they helped us is not true. the reason why Africans get sick and die is because of colonization with diseases that didn't, most of the diseases they die of didn't even exist back then. If we go to malnutrition, I mean, we could do this forever. We could go to ChatGPT and check, but if we compare malnutrition, Africans were sustainable for the most part in their areas. Malnutrition wasn't even a real thing, as I mentioned, and then people wrote about this, saying that there wasn't deep malnutrition. Then the European War started, the colonization happened, and then Africans lost their farms, they lost their areas, and then malnutrition started becoming a thing. Helped us with what?
And of course, once independence came, they were given an inheritance. They had the necessary conditions to thrive. I mean, it's not true.
They did not have the necessary conditions to thrive. That's the worst thing ever that he said. They basically started from scratch. They had to build upon European leftover laws and stuff like that. And a lot of those laws were racist, so they had to scrap a lot of them.
In the 1950s and 60s was, for example, in the Caribbean, that was a key era for the development of the Caribbean. You know, in Barbados, there's only one main hospital that was built by the British, one main university that was built by the British.
I don't even want to talk about the Caribbean because he already gave up when he said those Africans shouldn't have even been there. And then they removed some of the people that were native to those areas. So I don't even know how he can justify any of that. And then, of course, he says there's one major hospital. So what did they leave behind?
Haven't developed beyond that in Barbados because, of course, there's been economic mismanagement and corruption. And as I've said to you before, the countries in the Caribbean that are still crown dependencies are the ones that are thriving. 60% of Jamaica.
Which means that those governments were set up and those countries were set up in such a way to depend on colonization. And so that they can't be independent.
Jamaicans understand that, and they would prefer Britain never to have left.
Because they know
Again, we already looked at that thing where it says they would have preferred for Britain to have never left. It was not a major study.
Specifically, let me answer that specifically. As I said, this is what we call neo-colonialism. So when Jamaica becomes independent, and actually the reason Jamaica becomes independent is to stop Jamaicans migrating to Britain. That is why they made Jamaica independent, not because of some great moral thing. It's they want to stop people coming, and it largely works. But after Jamaica becomes independent, this is the problem with independence. It's independence in theory, but the economics of Jamaica stay the same. So the same people who owned everything in Jamaica still own it now. So the money is still being taken out, still being withdrawn, which is why obviously it can't succeed. Jamaica's economy is really collapsing and doesn't really show any signs of getting much better. And so yes, if you ask your average Jamaican, was it better under the British? They might go, yeah, it was a bit better. But that's because they're presented with this neo-colonialism, which is even worse. But the cause of it is still the same.
So I can't speak for every single place that used to be colonized, but I do know that because of this reality, places like South Africa, right, the black people don't own most of the land in South Africa due to this colonization history. And this is repeated over and over again. I mean, there's certain things, but you have to look at each place that the colonized lands aren't allowed to do to make their economies rise. And also, we fell into wars against communists and capitalists. So they put us in the middle of their wars. And we had to basically be part of Cold Wars that they fought over and over within Africa and other places. Now, of course, we're not even talking about every single place that was affected by the British Empire. Like they said before, the sun never set in the British Empire because it was so large.
Same. You still have to address it. So, for example, no, in Jamaica, and I know Jamaica well, I'm from Jamaica. Tourism is the main industry, right? 70% of the money from tourism goes straight out. There's the North Shore, where my family live in Jamaica. Most of it, literally, there's like no public beaches, or like a little slither of public beaches, because most of it's owned by foreign companies.
So this reminds me of the story about Jamaica's roads being owned by China. A small amount of them are owned by China, and this level of neocolonialism they started making it public for everybody to know once China started getting into the picture, because of course they're like, okay, don't start conquering our territory. One of the brags that China makes is the fact that they did not have to colonize through violence in order to get the economy they have, but that's because they are now taking part in neo-colonialism. As you can see here, Beijing Highway, $600 million road, just the start of China's investment in Caribbean. Road connection North and South Jamaica will be lined with luxury hotels and is China's largest investment in the Caribbean, but not for much longer. Which, keep in mind, 9 years ago, that was a long time ago. I remember hearing about this and thinking, wait a minute, what do they mean some of the roads are owned? By the way, this is not just a problem for Jamaica, because of course in South Africa, a lot of the gold mines are owned by the foreigners, foreign investors.
So the thing that's supposed to help us doesn't help us. It just drains the money straight out. That's the problem with something like Jamaica. It's not actually independent. It's theoretically independent, but economically, Jamaica's economy is still completely being rinsed by the West. And now it's not just actually Europe, it's also China, India's getting involved, etc., etc. So Jamaica's economy can't work. And so the people there might say, oh yeah, we want it was better then. But that's not proof.
Okay, you're acting as if the Jamaican government has no agency in any of this.
Oh, that was terrible. Don't get me wrong. It's the same thing. Not back in Jamaica.
But this is the problem.
So of course the trick here is to only blame one or the other, but obviously you can blame both. Obviously the government can be rubbish, and then at the same time it can be as a result of the things that were there previously, and the people who are still trying to colonize these lands now, which of course you can ask them, like, why don't they encourage that country? They encourage countries to do all kinds of things. Why don't they encourage the government of that area not to sell public land?
That you have. That's why people preferred things when they were run by the British. In Barbados, the Auditor General in Barbados has said that he can't actually get proper accounts for state-owned industries and enterprises. Can you imagine that? The Auditor General cannot get accounts on state industries in Barbados. That's the level of corruption and dysfunction that is created by having people in power who simply don't deserve to be there. And you can't keep blaming everything on what happened post-independence. It's now been 50, 60, 70 years of independence. That's long enough to sort your own house out.
Can I answer this question? Because the problem that EU stated, what was one of the key things that Britain needed was financial stability. And the former colonies simply don't have it because they can't have it. Because no, Britain did not leave the colonies in a state where they could govern. They did not. They didn't.
And the question, of course, is why would they? They were using it to drain resources. Why would they leave it in a position like, okay, it's ready now. You guys can go around and basically, if you want, be the most successful country in the world. The places that actually happened were those that forced Britain out very early and then worked with those places and they continued to exploit other people.
No, that's factually untrue. They left the colonies and states with roads that went to the airport, with maybe one hospital, maybe a couple of schools. They did not leave them in places where they could succeed, which is why most of the former colonies, almost all of them, fall into what we call third world debt, IMF, etc., which is just a new form of colonialism.
How could you even make this go away? I mean, think about it. These are multiple places not even touching each other. I mean, think about the Caribbean doesn't touch Africa. Africa doesn't touch some of the British areas in India and places like that. And those places don't touch other parts. So how could they even be talking about it? We talk about places that don't even connect. What similarities do these places have outside of being colonized?
That's the truth. That's fundamentally the truth.
No country did more to prepare its colonies for independence than Britain did.
Untrue.
And up to 2009, you had Britain invest the civil service.
So what he's saying over here is a script run, and the reason why he's saying it is because it's an easy out. He says no country did more to prepare their countries for decolonization than Britain did, which the way he's putting it is already very weird, because okay, no country did better. Okay, but how good did the other countries do to prepare? the other countries for independence. Now there's a little bit of a thing that you can talk about the French. They did a little bit more than the British did, but we'll talk about that another time.
This was present: military structures, parliament, courts, judiciary, the rule of law.
I'm talking about
police,
roads, infrastructure, hospitals. No, they didn't, because the evidence is clear on this.
Of course, you look at the number of schools, and I mean, for example, even after emancipation. So after slavery was abolished in 1833, enforced in 1844, for the next 10 years, from 1835 to 1844, with no obligation, Britain gave grants to the Caribbean for schools, for churches, and for hospitals and so forth, some equivalent to £1 billion today, right?
Sorry, can we say no obligation? This is, again, a massive problem we think about.
So again, I know very little about this, but I think it's interesting that when we use AI overview, Google, to see what they say, it says, yes, in the 1800s, after the abolition of slavery, Britain directed funds to the Caribbean to support education, particularly through the MICO charity, to build schools and establish teacher training colleges. This support was a response to the immediate need for schooling for the newly freed population and was intended to promote literacy and provide vocational skills. But it was initially limited and uneven. Post-abolition support following the abolition of slavery in 1834, the British Parliament instructed the MICO charity to use its funds to establish schools for free children and apprentices. So let's read the last part. While these efforts were significant, the number of schools and trained teachers remained small relative to the population's needs, particularly in the early post-abolition period. Now, keep in mind, this is not independent Jamaica. This is Jamaica when the British were still there occupying Jamaica. And you can tell that these grants were not necessarily given to the enslaved more than it was given to the people who were British.
Britain. The Jamaica was a colony of Britain. It had an obligation. When my dad came from in 1960 to here, he came with a passport.
Loans,
wait a second. No. They came with a passport that said Jamaica. It had every obligation because it owned the place. Yeah, I did. You've got
your wires crossed. I think what Rafe is saying is the money was given and there was no requirement to repay or to do anything in exchange.
No. My point is, it was part of the nation, so of course it was. There's no difference between Britain funding education in Jamaica and Britain funding education in Birmingham.
It's part of the empire. Benefits because it's a member of the Commonwealth.
That's actually pretty weird for him to say that, considering we're talking about independence. Like, so after independence, what did Britain do for that area in order to prepare it so that the people could run their own country? And he mentions what they did for slaves, which is going to be very different in terms of what is needed to run the country. And it was also very limited.
Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK given an inordinate amount of its foreign aid to former British colonies in the Commonwealth, right? So, as I said, $2 billion up to 2009. Currently, is £430 million of British money is earmarked for development there, and that's because, of course, of the ties. All right.
We're back in nerd territory. I want to wrap it up a little bit but can I ask you one thing before?
By the way, all these generous things that they apparently are doing today would all be dwarfed if they forgave third world debt, which they're never going to do because, of course, that would make those countries stable.
We wrap up, because you talked a lot about this kind of psychology of whiteness and whatever. Do you think there was something very particular about Western Europeans that made them do the slave trade, that made them behave in the ways that they did?
Not genetically or biologically, but the thing that was unique was that they ran into a world that was already global, and then they decided to be global themselves, and then they copied ideas of enslavement from the global people, the global markets that had already existed prior, and then they made it way worse because they wanted to be aggressive in competition, and they also were way more genocidal than any of the other people that came before. As I mentioned, in Africa, none of the numbers of deaths were ever close to what would happen after they got colonized and even after quote unquote independence.
That's a good question. I mean, talk about different mind. Yeah, maybe that's why the different.
Do you have a theory on
what that thing? Then you're happy with it.
Well,
there we go.
Different mind. I would not say different mind.
No, but I'm asking you, why do you think?
I'm glad he didn't bite into the trap about that, because I could see that was where it was going. That's why I started with not biologically and all of that, because I knew it's trying to get him to say the same thing and to see if he has the same biases towards Europeans that the other one has, and then they go, okay, well, that nullifies it then.
It could happen that way, because I guess the argument that I'm thinking about is, I mean, I personally have to say I don't know enough about it to really make a judgment, but I'm surprised to hear you say Africa was more developed. I'd always assumed that the reason the Europeans did what they did probably wasn't because they had some different special mind in that way, but actually it was because they just had the technology, they were more powerful, they were wealthier, so they could do this.
This is one of the mistakes that's made by a lot of people. So Africans started trading for guns with Europeans, starting with the Kingdom of Congo, West Africa, and all these places. And so it wasn't that they had this greater technology. When inventions started being invented, this is why, by the way, I don't use AI. If you ask ChatGPT, was there ever a telescope in Africa? I know the answer to the question, which is absolutely yes, because I read a book that says that they brought a telescope to Africa. But if you ask them, they're going to say, no, it's never happened. There's no evidence of that ever happening. But a lot of the technologies that would be discovered in Europe or spread through Europe would end up in Africa. I talked about the war that happened between Ethiopia, the Ottomans, and all these people, and they brought guns to defend against the Europeans.
In a way that actually everyone would have done if they were in a position to. So I guess what I'm getting at is, would Africans have colonized Western Europe if the shoe was on the other foot? Or do you think there's something special about white Europeans that made them behave in that way?
I see. So
before he gives his answer, there's something that's very important to separate here. If people were in the position to colonize, a lot of the time they did. But there's a difference between different types of colonization. There's a difference between what Genghis Khan did and what the Middle Easterners did. There's a difference between anybody, pick any king. Chandragupta was different than what the Islamic expansion did. Whoever, the Chinese expansions earlier were way different than what the Indonesian did. The Indonesians were way softer when it came to their colonization. It's not that people do not move and then take over different parts of lands. I mean, the Kingdom of Congo, people got democratic freedom when they were colonized by the Kingdom of Congo. But there was different where if you went to the Swahili coast, some of the places they colonized, they just were under Islam.
I'm so tempted to give a different answer to this question, but I'm really not. I'm gonna play nice.
Okay.
I think that when you look at it, this is why the West is. When I say the West, it really does mean going to the West. Europe going to the West and finding the Americas. The Americas is it unlocks so many things. It's not a coincidence that America is the richest part of the world. It's like that's the key that unlocks everything else.
Okay.
And
the real key behind it is that in America they had no mercy, and they had no mercy in the way that they affected America.
I think you have to be honest and say, well, who's the ambassador to the guy Columbus, Christopher Columbus, who goes over there, is one of the most violent, insidious people in the history of human life, right? And this is midpoint estimates.
So I've watched tens of debates about Christopher Columbus and how awful it is. And even for his time, he was one of the worst people. He even was told to return some slaves that he had gathered during his time. And he even was charged at the time. This is how brutal and violent this guy was personally. And then he made up excuses to kill people.
If you needed more reasons to think that Columbus was a Okay, let me add one to it. So, in one of the places, I think it's Hispaniola. This is his third voyage, 1503 or 1504. He's got to get back to Spain. He doesn't have enough resources. So he asks the natives, would you please give us some of your stock that you have collected from your farming? Now, this particular group of natives only makes exactly the amount of food they need to tie to the next crop. So they said no. Columbus knew that 1 week hence, coincidentally, there was going to be a total lunar eclipse. He says to the natives, if you do not give us food, my God, which is more powerful than your God, will make the moon disappear and it will turn blood red. That will happen in 1 week. You have 1 week to comply. Some of them were skeptical. What? You can't. What? Sure enough, right on cue, the moon begins to disappear. And notice the natives bowing to him, and he stands proudly because he knows the science. And they bring him all the resources he wants.
And this is all estimates. But the midpoint estimate of when he goes to Hispaniola, what's now Haiti and Dominican Republic, the midpoint estimate is he goes there and there's 8 million people. And this is the midpoint. It might be lower, it might be higher, I don't know. But the middle estimate. And that's 1492. When he eventually leaves in 1512, it's estimated that there are 20,000 people left. There's a huge decimation of life. When Europeans go to, because in largely it's disease, but it's not just disease, it's man-eating dogs, it's working people to death. The genocide.
It's robbing them of their resources.
In the Americas generally is the largest genocide in human history. It's up to 65 million people. And this is, I've read this and I was shocked. Apparently, the world actually cooled because so many people died, they were producing less greenhouse gas emissions and actually reduced the temperature of the earth. So if you think about the founding place for the West is the Americas, and how the West took over the Americas was the largest genocide in human history, like violence and disregard for life. And then where did they go to find the labor after they worked to death the natives? They go, oh, we've got this African slave. Let's go and enslave Africans, just turn them into non-humans.
Yeah.
Just think of that reality. So they go and steal land from Native Americans, decimate the entire population, enslave the remaining ones, and then have isolated places which defended themselves, like the Iroquois and some of the others who are still around. Then, after stealing land, go steal Africans, send them to that land so that they can work that land for free. And now you have stolen people in a stolen land who are literally working off of the graves of people who used to live there. How can anybody say that these empires were not literally the worst in history? There's nothing comparable in any place.
So if you were to say, yep, that barbarity, that anti-blackness, that racism, white supremacy, that's the difference. 100%. Okay. And that's what allows everything else to build.
So what I'm asking though is, do you think that if West Africans, let's say, they had the ships, they had the muskets, they had the gunpowder, they had the various different types of technology that enabled Western Europeans to go over to the Americas and do what you're talking about, right? Do you think that if the West African tribes, perhaps some of those more aggressive ones that enslaved other Africans, if they had all that technology and they went over to the Americas, do you think they would have behaved differently because of their different culture and background, or do you think they would have done the same thing?
So what he's basically asking here is if it's innate to human beings. Well, let me use a example that is real. They're called the Polynesians. So the Polynesians had technology, they had aggression, they had wars before, they even had some violent people who were way more violent than others. I mean, we know that in Papua New Guinea, there was also cannibalism. Yet when they went to the Americas and basically had islands completely to themselves, they did not do anything near what the Europeans did. And of course, we could talk about the Middle East. They conquered a whole bunch of places and other people couldn't do anything to them. They didn't genocide everybody. They didn't do anything close to that. West Africa did colonize in its own regions. Small tribes would eventually become some of the largest, conquering enormous pieces of land. There's no reason to assume that they would be as harsh when they got to America. If they got to America and started colonizing, it doesn't mean, in fact, we don't even know if they would have colonized. In fact, one of the reasons why we think they went to the Americas or one of the reasons they think they didn't go to the Americas is because they didn't leave this big impact which comes with colonization. It feels as if the Africans did go there, they just landed there, took a few things, and went back, as some of the stories state, especially the one about the Moors.
I think evidence says they did behave differently. Like I said, there's evidence that the Africans were in the Americas at least 1,000 years before Europeans. So I think certainly the case.
So although there is no full proof, there is definitely some evidence that makes us believe that some African tribes made their way into the Americas. And if that's possible, then there might have been some Native Americans that made their way to Africa. But that's something that we need to explore in a very delicate way. I don't like the whole heavy-handed, like, we've got the proof, but I also don't like the people who dismiss it and go, it absolutely could not have ever happened ever.
Would be that, yes, there is a difference.
Why do you think that is?
I'm not going to sit here and speculate it's because there's something better about Africans. African have a superior morality. But
it's just like, it's just the way that when you talk about whiteness, it's implied the way that white people think or white.
So I want to be clear here.
Okay.
Whiteness is a political thing, and even black people can have it. Whiteness is something to do with the system and the promotion of white supremacy. It has nothing to do with the mind.
I am not. See, it would be very easy for me to sit here. Who's my favorite person? Malcolm X, right? Say, look, this is the devilish nature of the white man. It just shows, and people say that all the time, right?
Right.
I'm actually saying that whiteness is not a bad.
You don't agree with that?
No, I don't think all white people are devils or have.
Okay.
No, I don't.
Right.
I think that we can debate what could have happened, what may have happened, why it was, but the reality is that it was that carnage, that racial exploitation that was necessary to create the society we have, that's why we have whiteness.
I'm not challenging.
So notice, by the way, that there's a give up of comparing African societies to European societies in reality. Now we're trying to compare hypothetical societies. Well, here's the problem with this comparison. Human beings are made up of individuals. It is possible, right, that Tip, right, if he had gone to the Americas, he would have decimated the entire place too. The point is not that nobody could do it. The point is that bad people do bad things. And the Western Europeans just so happened to have a lot of bad people at the time.
I don't know. I can't tell you why, but I can tell you that is.
But what I'm asking you to think about for the purposes of this guy, I think it's really important to this discussion, right, is you talk about whiteness. Mm-hmm. It's kind of hard to extricate that from white people. It's difficult for most people, at least, listen to this, right? And it's sort of implied within that the way whiteness operates is worse than the way other things operate, right? Mm-hmm. And what I'm asking you is, do you think if Africans had the same ability to dominate the native population of the Americas, would they have behaved the same or different?
All right, so
it really depends on who would have went there. I mean, in the case of Vasco da Gama, in the case of Christopher Columbus, in the case of all of these Europeans that went around, they just happened to be very, very violent people. And the ones that weren't that violent, when they came back, they were encouraged to be more violent. So, and some who were very violent were encouraged to be less violent. I'm not going to pretend that it was one way or the other, but there was an air of violence. Whereas, again, it would depend, because once you get the Omani in Africa, you start getting, still representing a foreign entity, they do have super violent slavery and all of that. So it just depends on who did it. You can't just say every single African would have been peaceful if they went there. I mean, if the Khoisan went to the Americas, would they have violently done anything? I don't think so.
Oh yeah, I'll be clear on this. No, I think when I say whiteness is an idea, and that is an idea that has come from Western Europe.
Yeah,
that is an idea that has been used to dominate the world. That was a necessary feature of doing it, because Africans went to the New World and didn't do this. So yes, there is something.
But they didn't
specific.
have the same technology.
Like I said, no,
they didn't have muskets and
as I said, when Europeans came in, they weren't massively more technologically advanced.
Oh, come on.
There's a reason why the Portuguese don't have slave plantations in Africa. They can't. They literally can't do it.
So let's make this very simple. So this is an image from the Kingdom of Congo. And as you can see, the people in the Kingdom of Congo have acquired a lot of the weapons that the Europeans have had. The Europeans, when they went to Japan, India, China, wherever, they had something to sell. They had things to take and things to sell. And one of the things they sold were bombards, were guns, were muskets, whatever you want to call them. They had all of these weapons, swords in some cases. They lost their advantage very quickly because they were willing to sell it very quickly. But in later years, of course, things started to rev up and started to get a little more dangerous. Had the Kingdom of Congo just took sail to the Americas, it was like, you know what, where are these Portuguese going? Took to the Americas, they could have set up their own colony there as well. And how do I know? Well, remember all the rebellions that the Brazilians had inside of that area, starting their own little colonies. The slaves started them, and they were a big problem to the point that the Portuguese, in some cases, had to work with them.
It's not the case that Europe's first impact, Europe first just comes into Africa able to control. It's not the case. It takes a long time to develop.
The jury's out on that, but let me come back. If they had the technology, of course they would have been the same. I mean, this idea that you didn't have terrible bloodshed happening and prejudice and the same sort of issues of racism happening within Africa. I mean, of course you did. If you know.
So now he's trying to pretend that Africans were racist, even though there was really one race in Africa, and there was no racism in Africa except for one group, the Middle Easterners, towards the Black Africans. And then when the Europeans came, they stole that same very concept. There was no thought of even racism in Africa. People did dislike people who are from different tribes, but those solutions would be done within 1 or 2 generations.
If you look in the Central Africa, you had the Bantu were persecuting the Pygmies and killing them.
So we need to be very careful here. A lot of people, they like to throw out this thing that the Bantus were going around persecuting the Pygmies and blah, blah, blah. Well, first of all, a lot of Bantus are Pygmies. So this idea that they were all persecuting Pygmies is not true. Secondly, Pygmies existed in large numbers until Europeans came, of course. They existed in large numbers around Bantu people, and they've always existed, and they're called Umtwa. Umtwa comes from the word Bantu. Umtwa means a small person. And yes, they've been existing there forever. They didn't persecute them. When they did attack them, it happened to be people who were extremely violent, who didn't care. And of course, these guys, being little people, would be in a disadvantage compared to the giant Bantu people. Now, I'm sure he's going to try and use some evidence, but most of it is going to come from after independence or during colonization, not in the prior years, because in the early years, you have no evidence that the Africans were doing anything to the Pygmies.
If you look in Ethiopia, you had the Bantus themselves were the victims and being persecuted.
So now he's just resorted to lying, because there is no accepted large-scale persecution of Bantu people by Ethiopians at all. Now, is there modern levels of discrimination? Very small. I mean, between the Bantus and the Ethiopians, there's not that much. At least if we consider much, anything close to what the Europeans feel about the Africans. In fact, I remember, I think it was Al-Masudi who said this, that the Zanj are so populous, the Zanj being the Bantu people, are so numerous that if there was a war that broke out between the Ethiopians and the Zanj would just destroy them because there's so many of them. And here it is. The water, which, as we stated, falls into the sea of the Zanj, forms an estuary which comes to the upper part of the course of this river, though through the country of the Zanj, and separates this country from the remotest provinces of Abyssinia. If it was not for this gulf, interadjacent deserts and marshes, the Abyssinians, Ethiopians, could not defend their country against the Zanj, the Bantus. for they are superior in numbers and bravery. So what is he talking about?
Somalia, the Abyssinians were murdering and hunting the Shankela, who are Nilotic Valley people. And this is not about...
So while the Ethiopians, which you can see here carrying guns, remember that, while the Ethiopians were targeting the Shankela tribes, these Nilotic tribes, it was not racial. It actually turned racial in the 20th century. For the most part, it had to do with the fact that they were pagans, Nilotic pagans, versus the Christian Ethiopians.
White supremacy. I mean, when African slaves were taken to Islam, to the Arab world, they were regarded as the lowest social strata because the prejudice is there. Same.
So he's right about that one. The people in the Islamic world were definitely racist.
Thing with the Chinese and the Tang dynasty, who of course regarded African slaves as the Kunlun and were frightened by them. So this is the idea that...
So of course, as I mentioned, the Kunlun did not just talk about Africans, and the ones that the Kunlun that they were frightened of were their immediate enemies, the Indonesians, that type of Polynesian, Indonesian things. Those are the ones that frightened them. The Africans did not frighten them at all. There's no evidence that they were frightened by Africans at all. But yes, also this is why I know this guy is being very selective. He has mentioned tribes off of his head that have basically most people have no idea. I mean, I know because I've researched Africa a lot, but this guy is rattling them off because he knows the information. He's just distorting it.
That something is unique to the West and unique to white people is simply not true. What is interesting, of course, is the exploration ethic of Europeans, which you don't find. As again, China had a massive fleet. Its ships were far better than European ships. It never discovered the Americas. You don't.
So, firstly, China is nowhere near the Americas. They have no need to discover the Americas. You know who is close to America, though? The Polynesians, and they discovered America. You know who else was very close to the Americas? Africa. And there's good enough evidence to say that it's possible that they did it. You know who else is close? The Vikings. And they happened to do that as well. Of course, multiple Asians had moved to America multiple times. That's why there's reindeer tribes that are very similar to the rest of Asia.
See the exploration that you saw within Europe, again, because of the distinction of the Western mind, and that whole concept of exploring and developing was very much fundamentally a European concept.
Wow, that is crazy what he just said there. That is literally... So the concept of exploring is a European concept. Really? So Ibn Battuta never explored the world? So Al-Masudi never explored. So all the Islamic explorers never explored. The African explorers, they didn't explore either. The people who, even after America had been discovered, the black Africans that actually were from kingdoms like the Kingdom of Congo, they didn't explore either. What about the Indonesians? Did they never explore? That is the single craziest thing he has said in this video.
You know, it's amazing, for example, it also goes down to individuality and the Anglosphere. So the first person to walk the length of the Nile was an Englishman, and that happened about 10 years ago. Imagine that, after all the thousands of years, the first person to walk the length of the Nile was an Englishman.
Or he's the first to be recorded, which, by the way, I know there were Siberians that walked from close to Japan all the way to like close to Sweden. So this concept that they were the first, no.
First person to walk the length of the Amazon was an Englishman. Also, one second.
How do you know this?
Well, in recorded history.
So you don't know.
Well, I'm sorry. It would have been. We do have record.
Walking for long distances for adventure's sake is something that already existed a long time ago. If you ever watch The Journey of Man by Spencer Wells, you will see that this is just typical of human beings. We're just explorers as a species. Now he says, and it's a very good point by Kahindi, where he says, "How do you know that no person has ever walked the length of the Nile or the Amazon before these people?" And then he says, "Records." It's like, what are you talking about? They don't have records of people for the Nile has existed forever. You telling me nobody has ever thought of going all the way down? We literally have evidence of people going all the way down.
You have
records that you have,
yes.
but you actually don't know.
Well, nobody who was African or South American has done it, at least within the last 300 years of recorded history. And that was, and the first person to walk.
Well, I wouldn't be too sure about that because there's a lot of recorded history that remains unread, especially when it comes to the Nile. Also, the fact that you're saying in the last 300 years tells you that your point about nobody has ever done it falls apart because you have no idea. Also, who cares if nobody has ever done it? That's not the full length of exploration.
The length of the Yangtze was a Welshman, again around 10 years ago. Now that's in China with an ancient civilization. Why did no one from China think about walking the length of the Yangtze? First person to walk around the world and run around the world, American and English. Same thing with Everest and so forth. There is a uniqueness to the West in the idea of exploring and discovering, which you don't see elsewhere, and that's part of the reason why you develop.
So your point
empires.
is the British love a walk. I get it.
What a pointless point that was. Especially if he's trying to prove that the Europeans love to explore and everybody else is just happy where they are. I don't know why this guy came on the show. Firstly, he shouldn't have lied. He should have revealed his power levels and started with this and just be like, listen, the brain of the European is much more superior and this is why. Don't do this slight like, oh, I don't mean Europeans. Just start with that.
I do want to come back because there is something specific about European rationality, which is the problem.
Tell me.
So there is when and I think and again, you don't believe me here, but you can't really separate whiteness from this. And so Descartes, I think, therefore I am.
I hope this guy didn't trigger him enough to set him off to try and get like a revenge tap, because that will be a big mistake.
Is really, I'm white and therefore I am. In fact, you've given this argument a bit today. There's something different about Europe, that we're not the natives, we're not Africans, we're not this. And that allows this separation of mind from body, which you actually don't see around most of the parts of the world. So African tends to be the
Chinese think they're different. The Japanese think they're very different.
Well, because of the introduction of racism, everybody thinks they're different. But the way that the Chinese and everybody else interacts with race is very different than how the Europeans do. I mean, I don't have to tell you, but there's many studies that show a lot of people who come from Asia actually want to be part of the European race when they get to the Americas, to the point where they ignore their own race.
The Chinese, if you think about the relationship to the earth, you think about there's something about European rationality, the distancing of it, that allows not just with people, but with the world, with the earth, with the look at the actual world is going to be destroyed by Europe, like literally going to be destroyed by
the Chinese thought they were superior to the whole rest of the world. They stopped developing because they thought they had reached peak civilization.
I'm not saying.
So there's a lot to hear that's being said, and obviously I don't agree with everything that Kehinde is saying, but I can see his point about how most cultures around the world are naturalistic, meaning the environment is taken into their philosophies, whereas a lot of the Western philosophies was that there's something special about being human that is different than nature.
Chinese, this is not about superiority. Japanese are superior.
Right.
I'm talking about the separation of mind from body. You don't see that in Chinese culture. There's a much more holistic version of what the person is. When you separate mind from body in that way, you can then distance yourself from certain atrocities in the way that we do. Like today, people, like 9 million people die from hunger today because of the West, and we're gonna go, okay, the exploitation of the earth.
So let me address the superiority thing again. So the superiority thing is a very difficult thing. The type of white supremacy that existed before and the one that exists now is very different than the Chinese thinking their culture was superior to everybody else. In fact, the Chinese, even today, are still made up of various groups of people. I mean, we say Chinese as if it's like one group of people, but they're made up of various groups of people. They don't have a strong history of completely throwing out people who are not like them. I mean, they've got decent amount of Indian DNA in the Indian corners.
In a way that is actually going to literally destroy the earth. I agree, there's something unique about that in Western rationality, which is deeply problematic, which allows us to kill, to maim,
and has
to
advanced
destroy
the world and improve,
and actually going to end the world.
Do
you know what? We were so close to a point of agreement there because you were both agreeing. And actually, maybe I actually, there is something to what you're saying in the sense that everything has a trade-off, right? So it's possible that a particularly slightly more rationalistic way of thinking about it has some negative trade-offs and a lot of positive things about it.
Yeah.
It actually could be very possible that in some ways you're both right on this.
I'm glad that Kahindi is not the easy battle that this guy thought it was going to be. And he's actually, because here's the thing, this guy in the middle is more on the side of the other white guy, but he is already, I'll say this is partially because he can be impartial, but he definitely is being swayed on the other side because Kahindi is giving strong arguments.
And on that bombshell,
we've actually managed to get the two of you to agree. No, gentlemen, I actually have to say I really appreciate you both coming. I thought we had a very informative discussion. These debates often descend into stuff. I thought we strayed away from that as much as we could. We'll wrap up in a second, but perhaps you'd like both to take a couple of minutes just to sum up based on this conversation, where just the core of your argument once again for people as we wrap this up.
They can sum this up in another time. I will upload that, and even if it's like 5 minutes, I will upload that. I don't have time to keep talking about this interview. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned a lot. I think that this debate style thing and some of the ones that I have lined up are going to be offensive to certain people, but I think it gives me opportunity to bring up some things that I wouldn't have just thought of immediately.